Hello, everyone. I'm Rick Zanotti, and welcome to eLearnChat, where talk is knowledge. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. And today we have with us the venerable Dawn Mahoney.
Venerable,
right back
wow.
from she is in the holy sphere of no longer ASTD. What is it? ATD now?
ATD.
ATD. That's going to take some time to get used to.
Yeah, you think?
You think? Well, Dawn,
20 some years of saying it, so.
and Dawn, you had a good show, right?
It was a very good show. We, renewed some relationships and forged some new ones. As I was saying before we went live, I got to meet Leva in person. She was with the Adobe team in the show, so that was a special bonus. Happy to be home, though, ready to sleep in my own bed for a few days.
That's great. And we have with us today Dr. Ray Jimenez from vignettes Learning. Hey, Ray, how are you today?
I'm doing great, sir. And how are you doing?
I am doing good. Now, Ray is a master storyteller, and we all know about stories and training, and this is the guy that makes it happen. So we are very happy to have Ray with us today. This is the third time on the show. So
Third time's a charm.
This is the charm.
Thank you.
He's going to knock it out of the park today.
Oh, my God.
No pressure, no pressure.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. So, Ray, tell us, what have you been up to lately?
Well, I've been, we have to constantly try to invigorate ourselves. And I have been researching on the value of stories, especially the interactive part of stories, and see how we can leverage that into many of what we do in e-learning and social learning and the like. So it's been an incredible experience. I'm excited to share to you a few ideas, and hopefully a few of you can be able to use them.
That sounds really good. So, Ray, what are you seeing as different or new in the industry? Any changes that you see, especially in the everybody talks about the story, which makes sense. It's kind of like e-learning gets to it very slowly sometimes, but
right.
It is about storytelling. It's about transmitting knowledge that has some sort of relevance and context. What do you see different or new that you're experiencing with your company and your services and the things you do?
Well, as you know, we are now in the third generation of e-learning. The first generation is that we were all happy many years ago to upload all our PowerPoints and avoid travel. That's the first generation. In the second generation, what's going on is that we are suddenly so tired of all of these PowerPoints. So linear, click forward. It's a common complaint.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it seems that there's many solutions, software solution, multimedia solution, platform solution, but none has really spent time in addressing how do you do and what do you do with your content. So I call it the e-learning band-aid. We keep on putting a lot of stuff in our multimedia program and in games without rethinking about our content. So one of the things I discovered in my own realm of my own work, and it's limited to my own experience naturally, is that, and I'm surprised who's responding to this, is that when we transform content online, we forget the most important part, which is the context and the stories related to the content.
Right.
So we end up with just very abstract and very technical content without the component of the context, which is story. So that's generally a realization that people wanted to fix.
Yeah. And do you think we're getting there?
Well, it's very interesting that because of the unhappiness of people, I get a few calls from people, and I've been trumpeting this issue since 10 years ago, but it seems like people have settled and are now unhappy, which is both good and bad, unhappy with a lot of the programs. They're trying to find ways and means.
Yep.
And I think there's different growth areas. For example, people are trying to fix their content to become more interactive. Some people are trying to make their content smaller. But what I see the movement are sort of the emergence of easier software, being tired of bad content. Now people are realizing that we need to do something about it. And the most interesting experience I had was that I was running a workshop on story-based e-learning. And the people who would respond to the workshop are completely surprised to me. They are manufacturing companies, large compliance companies, energy companies. You would think that they are happy with their material, but they come back to me and says, we require our people to go training 200 hours a year on the same topic, and they're just like throwing up.
Right.
There's a major revolt around it. So the serious consideration, a lot of developers now are already trying to find ways and means on how they can improve it, especially in adding context to their learning.
Yeah. And one thing you do, if I recall correctly, is you do a lot of videos as well, which, again, bring it to life more.
Yeah, videos is, I love videos like what we're doing right now. The challenge is that most videos are using the concept of what you call talking heads. People talk about the videos, talk about technical content, and everybody's sleeping. So what we have done primarily when using videos or images is to make sure that you combine together, first and foremost, the fact or the technical content with a relevant event. Now, that is the storytelling part of it. The other part of it is how do you bring in the learner to the story, which is a big difference actually here, Rick, in the sense that we are so used to telling a story, but sometimes if you don't bring in the learner to the story, you're still losing the learner. So that is what I thought might be interesting to discuss this morning.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good point. Now, one of the things you were talking about last time we met is you were using Articulate Storyline a lot because of the way they kind of approach the story and the scenes. And how's that been working for you?
Oh, it's great. I've been, of course, I'm biased with Storyline. And the reason I love it is because if I were to start my authoring career today, you know, I'm only 32 years old, as you can see with my gray hair. Right?
You're I think, a year younger than I am.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, 33, right? Okay, I don't know about Dawn, but anyway. The tool, Storyline, if I were to build my consulting career today, I would pick up Storyline because it's simple enough to get going, but it's advanced enough that you have a lot more life into it.
Right.
So it's profoundly different in that direction. There are many other competitive tools as well that are good, but the learning curve is relatively manageable, and the more deeper you go to the tools, the more you discover a lot of interaction with it. So I love the tool.
Yeah, one of the things I find with Storyline, and I know Dawn's been using it too, I think, is...
Yeah, not recently, but yes.
Yeah, I like the fact that it makes you think, or it lends itself to thinking much more interactively. And that's one of the best things about it. And it makes interactivity easy. And there's a lot of add-ons for it you can buy from different groups, and it's just a lot of fun to get creative with it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with their next version, which I guess is sometime this year, hopefully.
Hopefully.
It should be good. I mean, it's been a couple of years now, so I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. There's going to be some good stuff, I'm sure. So
maybe in time for DevLearn?
Maybe, or no, DevLearn is at the end of the year. I'm hoping more mLearn. I don't know.
Okay.
It's been a while. I think last time they released in March or May, maybe in May. That'd be good. We are in May. That'll be great.
One of the things I do is to make sure I continuously learn Storyline is I teach Storyline. I teach a basic course with Kevin Thorne and Trina, and then we also teach advanced courses so that this is a good advice for everyone. If you want to learn something, teach it, because you are like about 90 days ahead of your students, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's great.
If you're lucky, you're 90 days in advance.
Maybe.
When it comes to technical training. We should have Kevin on the show sometime.
We've had him on, but we have to have him on again.
Of course. Yeah, good guy.
And Trina. We've never had Trina on. We should have Trina on. She is fun.
Never, yeah.
Trina Rimmer?
Yeah, this is Trina Rimmer, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I like her.
Love her, yes.
She's
very
good.
fun. Very fun. So Leva is on, and so you know she's a Captivate person. So do you, is there any way that you could parallel the same line and thread of conversation with us on the Adobe side of the house?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I mean, Adobe is a powerful tool as well. And it so happens that when I compared both of them, I have a dozen, over a dozen Flash developers in my team. And when I run the survey to them, they found out that they can do a lot more easily and faster with Storyline by transforming many of the Flash tools rather than in Captivate. Now, It might have been a very limited research on their part. So I'll allow them to say that the more complex stuff, you do it your own in Flash. But the more basic thing that you used to do in Flash, do it in Storyline so that we have lesser cost and faster in development.
Yep.
So we have also people who use Captivate, but it's just one of those research that these technical guys do, and they concluded in that direction.
All right, Ray, do you want to start sharing your screen and show us a little bit what you were talking about?
I'd like to see even here that, let me go back to my share screen and show you a little bit of ideas, and hopefully you'll be able to see how to apply some of these ideas you mentioned. So you can see my screen, right?
Yep. And there you are, you're sharing.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I've been researching on is to do this story-based technical and compliance program. And let me try to show you a little bit of an example here by showing you a frame, and I'll show you just a bit of it, and so that you can see what we're trying to accomplish here. Can you show this?
Yes.
Can you see this? Okay. There's a little bit of audio, and I will not play all of it, but to illustrate to you a jumping point. Okay, you ready?
Yes. And Ray, if there is audio, we're not hearing it.
I don't think Ray can hear us now.
Okay, now let me interrupt this. This is a very short illustration in the fact that...
Oh, Ray? Ray?
Yeah,
We didn't hear anything.
Oh, you didn't hear anything?
No. Did you mute your speaker?
No, I did not.
Okay. It did not come in, though.
It is probably lower, but I can explain it a bit, right?
Okay.
So this is an illustration of the complement, which is a story about this lady and this gentleman. And the gentleman was, the lady was complaining about the guy looking at her chest rather than complimenting with her work, right? So what we're doing with story design, therefore, is to look at this and say, how can we express a content like sexual harassment by bringing the learner into a real-life situation? Because the usual tendency that we do in our design is we do a lot of linear learning, and you all know that. You know, in A here in my screen, linear, 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 linear. Well, what we're trying to do in B is to move the learner from an experience of emotional and logical experience so that they end up understanding the story. So in essence, we cannot separate the fact with the story. If we teach fact, we expect learners to memorize it, and they don't remember it. But when we associate a fact with an event, they tend to memorize it, and they tend to remember it in a more reliable, and they also have fun doing it. So the next slide in here, I just want to show you the difference. The typical approach when we do training, this is boiler maintenance, right? We lecture, or we have a flip PowerPoint about number one, show the steps, blah, 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 this is what you do. Or number two, we say, show repairs, this is what you do. But people tend to pay attention more to number three. They pay attention to the consequences of the content, so that they know the value of the content in what they do. So in order to design this, we start with the consequences to bring in the learner an understanding so that they can connect with the content in the quickest possible way.
So that's putting it in context right away, correct?
Yep, absolutely. Boom. The first thing you do is to bring them to the context, because if you're going to start talking about the fact first, like our learning objective is 1, 2, 3, you've lost them in 3 seconds.
Right.
The idea is to bring them very, very quickly.
And you know, you're bringing up a good point, because if you're learning how to fix a boiler and it explodes, you don't have time to say, what am I going to do next? I'm going to learn how to do. You need to get in there and fix it.
Right. Exactly.
So that is your objective immediately.
Very good. Very good observation. And in fact, we are discovering that instead of having a very long table of contents of this is the definition, this is the steps, this is the procedure. You turn it upside down and say, these are the events that are related to the content.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. And then they learn backwards. They now go to the content as a result of them understanding and being motivated by an event. So that's a primary thing that I've been observing, Rick. And there's a principle to this, of course. And you have the cycle. You come up with a must learn, which is what I call small bites. You cannot have a story for the entire program because you cannot afford it. I mean, people have misunderstanding that, oh, it's very costly to have a story because you have to build an entire production crew. So the only way to do that is to apply your stories only on the must-learn content. Don't apply it to the entire program when you don't need a story. Like, people are doing e-learning by converting their PDF, and then they narrate the PDF. It's so boring. Now they add a video on top of the PDF. So the first thing to do is to identify the most important part of the content, because it's bytes by bytes.
Yeah.
And then find the story and find the event and put them together. And then now leads me to the next issue here, which is now what you call the story questions. In order to bring in the learner, we need to ask them questions. So for example, in the screen, and I can show you a link to this one as well, avoiding burglary. Setup is the first thing, which I call the objective. How serious is the risk if the burglar breaks into your store? How does it impact the safety of the people? How does it affect your company's assets? That's number one. You ask them a question. It's a statement of the objective. Number two, one day you came home and saw this man. What would you do? So you ask the learner a question every step of the way. And then finally, what could you have done to prevent this? You're now asking the learners to interpret the story, and then finally go to how do you apply this in your real life situation.
Now, Ray, this is something we run into a lot, and I'm sure you do too. A lot of companies think that if you take this approach, then they're not learning. They want to go through the old method of, okay, here's our objectives. How do you broach to them that this is a more effective approach?
It's very interesting. I have a research that I constantly do. What I do is I put together side by side a very, very oversimplified technical content. Learning objectives, this is how to define it, this is where you find the regulation, the procedures. And then beside that, in the same content, I insert one or two snippets of stories, instances of the stories to raise the awareness of the learner on that particular page. And I run a survey. It's amazing that people would say 80% of the time, it helps us to remember better the content. Number two, it helps us engage better ourselves with the content. And finally, it makes the content a lot easier. So I suppose the only way that can be done, there's a lot of research on this one, Rick. I can show research, but we have in our corporation right now what you call, of course, a major velocity of people moving into a momentum of just doing linear learning. And all of our testing and all of our completion is based on how much you pass this memorization test.
Sure.
But people are very unhappy with that. But the solutions is also very undefined. So you can go back to corporations and companies and organizations and nonprofit and say, by the way, if you test your concept, you have to understand that people don't really retain content unless you associate it with events. And show them a small case study. People are open to it, at least in many of the things that I do.
Yeah. That's definitely a good approach.
Yeah, and it helps a lot. So here's the nucleus of the idea, the kernel of the idea. First, you have a fact on the left-hand side, and then, or the right-hand side, fact, and then you have to associate the fact with the event. Now, you have a fact and the event, that is the story part. But you have to allow the learners to have their own interpretation of the story. You have to allow them to fill in their own story, because otherwise they will not understand the story. This is the big difference now, Rick and Don, with telling a story or asking the learners to interact with your story and your content. So this is a three process. And then that's why the powerful part of the story questions is important. What would you do? Have you been there? What will you do in that situation? How would you apply them? While the story is running, you ask these questions so that the learners are drawn into the content, and then you apply the application side of it. So I call this the kernel. And it applies in any other content. It's the same thing. It's so basic in that regard.
What's interesting, if you've looked at interactive HD videos, you can choose almost the ending of some of these. It's the same kind of idea. You're looking at the story, go, how do you interpret it? What do you think the ending is?
Exactly. And I love this because a long time ago, I had this project with the DOD, and they were trying to get me to this story and scenarios. And the instructional designers could never come up with a nice ending in a scenario, because every time somebody makes a mistake, you know what the instructional designers would do? Bang, you made a mistake and you should go back there.
Oh,
And
with
then-
the red stop sign too sometimes, or a hand.
Yeah, a hand, right? And then if you do correct, yay, you do. What happens there is that the lecturer and the trainer is interrupting the story. So one guy I hired from Hollywood, a starving artist, who was like writing scripts of the movies in the morning and waitering at night, right? He came to me and said, if you are going to use a story, a context or way of delivering the content, allow the learner to fill in the gap of the story. Don't make the conclusions for them, because the learning is for them to make their own conclusions. That is where the learning is, learning and unlearning. So he told me a story that's very interesting to prove this point. He said, when you watch a movie that you love, you get teary-eyed at the movie, you really get moved with the movie. When was the last time you saw that movie, and then someone at the end of the movie explained the movie to you? No one. Because no one explains the movie to you to appreciate it. You have to be the one concluding about your movie. So it's very similar to what you just mentioned, Rick.
Right, and in fact, that's an interesting point. I remember, watching movies back when from Steven Spielberg. He's a good director, but I find him manipulative, because he doesn't give you that much of a chance to interpret as much as you will cry now, or you will do this. And to me, it's okay, but it's definitely more spoon-fed. It's like giving it to kids. Okay, here's what you get, and now let's have this reaction. Whereas I find other directors who maybe, like you just said, elicit the response. It's a huge difference in the outcome.
Right.
And the way you remember the movie.
Yeah, and of course you remember that when you go through after the movie, you have an argument with your wife or the person that went to the movie, and that's where the beauty of the movie is, right?
Yeah.
Now, so in learning, therefore, this conversation continues in the mind of the learner, because the event associated with the fact is very strong in their mind, because they're together. And then they keep on asking questions to reinterpret the story, and that is exactly where the learning happens, the opportunity for the learners to come in and interpret the story based on how they see it.
Now,
So I call this model SRIA, because it says set up, relate, interpret, and apply. Set up, relate, interpret, and apply. Very short, few seconds of one tiny nugget.
That's good.
Rick, go ahead.
Now, do you do things like, for example, when you do this kind of training, do you ever go into the blended approach where you ask them afterwards how they perceived it, what they got out of it? Do they discuss it? Is that something that you've seen or do?
Yep. Absolutely. What I discovered in my own experimentations and testings, that when you're looking at story is the way we communicate with each other. But underneath it, we're really telling our experiences. So, therefore, after an online program like an e-learning, all of the tools that are now in social media or social learning, discussion room, etc. and the like, and I'll show you a specific example right now, they need to be nurtured in terms of allowing them to participate, because the sharing is actually story sharing. Experience sharing is actually story sharing. So we extend to that. So we call it blended, yeah, but I call it more of a structure for sharing stories and experiences, which just builds and builds on the content. So you have a very good point there, Rick.
So more than blended, it's actually almost a social media type experience afterwards, where they all share what they saw or felt. And actually, it's not even what they saw, what they felt.
Yeah, which is what they felt, and because what they're doing in the sharing of experiences and stories, they're bringing in the content into their own lives. This gentleman in the screen right now, the book that I've been reviewing, and there are many, many ways to approach this. There's an artificial intelligence proof that supports this. There is a social psychology. There's a neuroscience that support this. But I love this gentleman. It's called Michael Corvallis. He wrote something about the recursive embedding in our mind, the recursive learning. Our minds are constantly in iterative mode. We know that, right? Mm-hmm. But this is what I like the most. We insert ourselves in the ideas and stories and make them our own. And this is why you have to talk about it. You have to interpret it, because unless that fact and that event becomes your own, you're not really learning.
Yeah.
And this is where the gap with the learner training program as a process, right? So it's very, very exciting, and there's a lot of possibilities. In adding on, let me jump into this slide in here. Can you see this one, Rick? This is a slide where the only difference in my experience of what we're doing and using social media tools in order to improve story design is we need to sort of manage the sharing so that it becomes substantive in value. Because otherwise, you're going to have a lot of 95% chatter, right?
Right.
So when people contribute, we ask them to classify, at least in this example, whether it's a best practice, or whether it's a solution, or whether it's an idea, or whether it's a test concept, or whether it's a result. So when they respond to a question, they are more substantially bringing in their experience rather than chit-chat that may not bring in add value to this relationship,
Sure.
right? And then you allow them to relate and connect with each other to facilitate the interrelatedness of their experiences. So this is just a screen view of how you extend the story into experience sharing as a mode. Now, the real thing to remember here is this. The reason why social media, in my humble experience, doesn't have direction is because we have forgotten that people only react to stories.
Yeah.
And most of the social media we have are not defined specifically to connect content and stories. So people don't seem to react to it very well. But if you package together an actual event, an actual fact, and as a learner, then you bring into the learner in a really more robust experience sharing conversation. Rick, go ahead. You have a comment to make.
No, I'm actually just nodding my head yes.
Yeah,
So.
and it is fascinating. So for example, this one, I don't know if I can show and play this to you. I'd like to play this very quickly. This we did with a client, and I'll put a little bit my audio higher so I can probably share better, right?
Okay.
And this is very few seconds. It's called Flirtation. We designed this for a large high-end retail store for their call center people. But look at this. I hope you can listen to it.
We can't hear it, Ray.
You can't hear it? Okay.
No, it's very, 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 very faint.
Okay, good. So anyway, what we'll do is we'll continue with it. So there's an audio. So there's a role play of this person, right, as a caller for that person. And then you go in here, and then the person says something like this, right? Screen. And he says that you might be looking very hot in person. That's what he says to the call center person, and then you give them options. Now, we call this micro scenarios or micro stories, but in this very short few instant, you have packed in under 10 seconds an event in a person's life, which will bring them in to the content of how to handle a really freaky customer that calls you at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Right. So this is an example of this, Rick, as an illustration and a good resource in order for people to reflect that the story doesn't have to be long. The story doesn't have to be a long storytelling. You're only looking for an event that is connected to the fact that you want the learners to remember.
Yeah, and in the case of a customer service training type thing, that's perfect because that is hitting something that they come across every day. It's in context for them. Oh yeah, we've been through that. Yeah, we get the jerks calling all the time, or we get this person, or an angry person, or a happy person. And at 2 a.m, you get all sorts of strange people too. My wife did reservations once for an airline, and it was interesting because she said she worked the graveyard shift, and she goes, it was amazing. Who would call in, and they'd have the sex callers, and they would actually play with them. They would pass them on to each other just to get the person frustrated, and they'd leave. But it was interesting. She goes, oh, you'd be surprised how little business gets done at that time, and how many strange people have nothing better to do than call an airline. And I'm sure it's probably gotten worse since then, but it is interesting. Dawn, any comments in the chat room?
I've got nothing for you in the chat room, but I was intrigued to see that character you just showed has his eyes and his mouth moving, so I'll have to figure out how to do that. A new skill I'll have to attack.
Well, there's a tool you can buy. Well, I think it's a subscription service, Go Animate.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And Go Animate, I think it's $50 a month, and you can animate these characters. It looks actually pretty easy. I think we're going to be using it real soon. It looks kind of cute. It's another tool to make life a little bit easier. Then you can insert it into your Captivates, your storylines, Lectoras, whatever you use, and it works pretty well.
I was going to ask, you continue to use the word story even when you're talking about what I would call a situation or a scenario, and I wondered if you wanted to make the distinction from your perspective, Ray.
Right. A scenario is really, at the heart of a scenario is a story. Mm-hmm. This is very funny because a lot of people call the branching exercise as a scenario.
Right.
But they're like memorization exercise, right? Okay, so because they're all fact, click here. Those are branching. And that's good because it can do some thinking about the process. But the heart of a scenario is a story. And in every one of those events must be a continuation of a story. So, for example, this flirtation guy is only part of the story, and you can continue a lot of different events around that, then you have a scenario. Now, I am biased to micro scenarios because of the fact of affordability. I've been teaching scenarios for a long, long time. I wrote a book on scenario-based learning, but the problem is that when learners or designers look at it, they'll suddenly get overwhelmed because they said, I don't have the budget, we'll never be able to get out of it. So I thought that letting them go through a micro story builds their confidence and builds quickly how they can use it and insert it in their e-learning and make it that area. So that's how I would distinguish it from branching, from scenarios, and a micro story, Dawn. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Dawn, and what you do, you work for a company that takes care of seniors.
That's right.
I could think of millions of scenarios for what you guys are doing. And
that's beautiful.
do you do training like that where you, for example, put a scenario, let's say there's a patient who maybe has Alzheimer's and is lost, confused, don't know where it is, and then so you start with the problem. Do you ever do anything like that, or have you run into that?
Our former LMS until this year wasn't capable of having that level of robust development. So we're in the process of rebuilding courses and building new courses because we have a new, more robust LMS that can have Flash and so forth in it.
Okay.
We're just getting there.
Slowly but surely.
That's right. Can't say enough about how much better we can have HTML, we can have tagging. We had something from the dark ages. It was one step above being DOS. So, yeah, and you laugh, it's true. And I have a friend who works for state government. She actually works for a county, but they're involved in state government in a very large, very heavily populated state in the southern half of the United States, and their LMS is still DOS-based.
DOS?
Yeah.
And I still see large companies today that doesn't have an LMS, and they still use Excel.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I would take Excel over having to do // to get any information I needed to. So.
Yeah. Now, Ray, one question I have, and that is, how do you approach the storyboarding or the actual script writing of the scenarios? Do you use, because people always ask and send in questions about what kind of format do you use? Do you use a Word doc? Do you use an Excel spreadsheet? Do you use a 3-column multimedia type format? How do you write your storyboards? That's what people really get stuck on right in the beginning. What do I do?
Yeah, well, the storyboard is you can do anything that works for you and your client or for your internal team. You could do PowerPoint, you could do Word document. I think what is important is what's inside your storyboard. Like, what is your structure inside your storyboard? What are the details? And you have 2 or 3 columns. The first column is your content. The second column is your image explanation. The same. I mean, it's how you design what's in the storyboard. And if somebody emails it to me, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of storyboard. But it is really more attuned to the nature of your content. If your content is too big, we even use Storyline to do, how do you call it, storyboarding. But what has been really helpful has been the use of mapping tools. For example, we use Bubble.us, which is for free, Bubble.us for free, or other mapping tools.
So mind mapping tools?
Yeah, mind mapping tools. We start with the mind mapping tools, and then you put in the link to the individual portions of the mind map to an individual storyboard of a unit. Now, this is because I do a lot of work which is more dynamically open-ended structure rather than a linear structure, right? So that's the way to do it. But the mind mapping helps you and the instructional designers and the client and your internal champion to have a better view of your material, and therefore you can do that. So there are many, many tools to use a storyboard.
That's interesting. We just started using more mind mapping. I bought Xmind, which runs on a Mac, and I think it runs on PC too, both of them. And I got that one from the guy who wrote, Chris Carter, who wrote Mist, the original Mist. And he says now he's he's creating a new one. And he said, we use mind mapping for all of the scenarios, all the different ways we can navigate and everything else. So you find that very effective.
Yeah, I find it very helpful because what I discovered was that if I go to my subject matter expert and I'll show them a linear storyboarding, then the entire program ends up to be linear. So what I do is I take an opportunity to tell them, okay, this is the map of the knowledge you want your learners to do. And then it's all over the place. You start with, what we do is we have a brainstorming and we use post notes, right?
Yeah.
You got a big whiteboard, a big entire wall whiteboard, and you map the information. And then now subject matter experts begin to open up their mind and say, whoa, you can really learn it by hypertext approach. You can learn it by scenario and discovery approach. Although you have an outline, they now begin to see that you can really put a very, very diverse perspective of the content. So there's a lot of tools, but mind mapping and mapping tools are very, very useful for the learner.
There's so many. There are a lot of free ones that are pretty good, but I know I talked with somebody at the Presentation Summit last fall, and they use an enterprise version of Prezi in a whiteboarding capacity in that same way. You can annotate in real time and people can see it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, the collaborative nature of it is actually more important now because the approval and the review is really the pain in the neck with this storyboarding. So if you have the conversations, like an extension of it is a wiki-like tool in the storyboarding, then you're able to dynamically change the storyboard as you're developing the storyboard.
Now, what kind of tools can you recommend for a wiki type approach to the storyboarding?
Well, you can even use WordPress, and you can even use, I use a lot, Basecamp. They have a small, how do you call that? They have a small thread in the area where they do a lot of the wiki-like function, because I can connect that particular wiki tool with the project tool. So you have an accounting of the deliverable of that particular wiki tool, plus the timeline and the budgeting of that particular storyboarding. So, but I would imagine there's a lot of other tools out there, a lot of flexibility that anyone can test and try.
You can try Join Me. That's a screen sharing.
Okay. Yep.
Free screen sharing app.
Yep.
Yep. Any final questions in the chat room today?
Nope. We have no one in the chat right now because we're on the wrong day.
Wrong day.
That's probably true. Chats are never that busy anyway. I think the most
they like to listen.
Yeah, people there's a lot of lurkers.
Sure.
But, we are at the end of our time. We can go on forever. I know Ray and I have had long talks in the past, and we can pretty much go on forever. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. And I think the work you're doing is absolutely fabulous. And the approach is just very effective.
Thank you.
Very effective, and that's really what it's all about. We still run into so much of we want objectives, and we want this and we want that, and you just go, okay. And you try to argue the point. Doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, not often. Just depends on the clients, what they want, what they don't want, or what they perceive. And of course, when you're doing compliance training, it's not about learning. It's about getting your indemnification done. You've got your 45 minutes. You're indemnified. Now get lost. It's just, that's not a good way to avoid the problems. That just kind of covers it up. And we talked to someone yesterday who was saying, wait till they figure out that learning is not appropriate, and you get learning experts saying, no, this wasn't very useful, then the lawsuits will continue happening again. Mm-hmm. Indemnification is relative. So it's kind of an interesting aside. Well, Ray, love to have you on again.
Good, thank you.
And I think we're talking about doing some special things in the near future, and that'll be a lot of fun. And Dawn, as always, a pleasure.
Keep me in the loop.
We always keep you in the loop. You are the loop.
I am the loop. Oh, okay.
You are the loop. You control the loop.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Don. And thanks, Rick.
Thank you so much, Ray.
Sure.
Yeah, and for all you guys watching, not necessarily in the chat room, if you are watching the chat room, thanks for being there. If you're watching the recording, please subscribe, send us feedback. We will be putting links to Ray's sites, and so that you can go visit his site anytime. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.